Chapter 25. The Speech. You cannot give a 20-minute proof to 400 people. I had learned that across the loops. The proof worked one-on-one, on a Maya, on a Hollis given long enough, but a crowd doesn't watch a single neighbor die and conclude I should follow this man to a farm. A crowd that watches a neighbor die concludes run, and scatters, and the apocalypse picks it off in pieces. To move 400 people, I needed something I had never needed before, because I had never tried to save 400 people the right way before. I needed them to believe me fast, before 6:51, before the first monster, with no time to prove anything. And the only currency that moves a frightened crowd faster than proof is recognition. They had to look at me and see someone who already knew them, which, of course, I did. I knew all of them. I had watched every one of them live and die through 63 iterations of the same 11 days. I knew their names, their fears, their small private kindnesses, and their small private cowardices, knew who would freeze, and who would run, and who, given one reason to be brave, would become the bravest person on the block. So at 6:35 I climbed onto the roof of a parked bus in the middle of Ashford's main square, where the morning crowds were already gathering under their blue boxes, frightened and milling and ready to bolt, and I did not try to prove anything. I just started saying their names. Tomas Reynoso, I said, and a thick-necked man by the fountain jerked like I'd touched him. Your daughter's name is Pilar, and she's 7, and she's home right now in the blue apartment on Sumner with a fever. And you're standing here because you came out to find medicine, and now there are monsters in the sky, and you are about to run home to her. And I am telling you, don't run home alone. Bring her here. I will keep her alive. I have done it before. The crowd rippled. Tomas Reynoso stared at me with his mouth open. Grace Okafor, I said, finding the old woman near the back. Your son James is going to die today at 11:51, unless you do exactly what I tell you. And I know that's a monstrous thing to say to a mother, and I'm saying it anyway, because it's true, and because I can stop it. Della and Marcus from the gym, the 2 men by the smashed storefront. You're strong and you're scared, and you're about to decide that strong and scared means you should fight your way out. It doesn't. Today, strong and scared means you carry the people who can't walk. That's the job. That's the only job that matters today. I went down the square like that, name after name, fact after impossible private fact, and I watched the thing happen that I had gambled everything on. The thing that no proof could do, but that recognition could. A frightened crowd cannot be argued into trust. But a frightened crowd that hears a stranger on a bus roof speak the secret name of its sick daughter, its doomed son, its private fear, that crowd goes very, very quiet. And into that quiet, you can pour a plan. I know how this looks, I said, when the square had gone silent enough to hear the distant hum of the seam. I know I sound insane. I know how I know your names is the most frightening thing that's happened to you this morning. And a monster came out of the sky 10 minutes ago. So that's saying something. A few people laughed. The terrible thin laugh of people at the edge. And the laugh was good. The laugh meant they were still human, still reachable. So I'm not going to ask you to understand it. I'm going to ask you to do something. And I'm going to tell you exactly what. And I'm going to tell you why it'll work. And then in about 12 minutes the sky is going to tear open over the Crossroads Mall, and the first monster is going to come through. And you're going to see that I was right about that. And you're going to decide, in that moment, whether to trust the man who knew your daughter's name. I told them the plan. Not all of it, not the gods, not the tower, not the ledger. There was no time and they were not ready, and some truths have to be earned in order. I told them the part they needed. There is a hill, on the east edge of town, the Emberstone Farm. There is a wall there, and a deep beneath it, and food, and people who know what they're doing. Go to the hill. Do not go to the mall. The mall is death. The mall looks safe, and it is the worst place in the world. And at 6:14 tonight, you will understand why. Go to the hill. Carry whoever can't walk. Bring water, and bring children, and bring nothing else. Move now, while the monsters are few, before the packs come. The hill. Go to the hill. And at 6:51, the seam over the Crossroads Mall finished tearing, and a thing the size of a refrigerator and the color of a bruise came through it, exactly where I'd said, exactly when, and 400 people watched it happen, and then 400 people turned and looked at the man on the bus roof who had known their names and known the monster and known the hour. There was a silence, the longest silence of my life. It is the silence I will remember on whatever passes for my deathbed. 400 frightened people on the last morning of the world, deciding. And then Grace Okafor, the old woman near the back whose son James was going to die at 11:51, picked up her bag and turned east, toward the hill, and said in a voice that carried across the whole silent square, "Well, you heard the man. Move." They moved. 400 people is not a crowd you save. It is a migration you manage, and managing it was Sela's masterpiece. And I'll tell you about Sela's part next. But I want to end this chapter on the bus roof, in the moment the square turned east, because of what the system said to me, what Cass said to me, in the private channel of the hum, where no administrator could hear, as 400 people I had watched die 100 times began, for the first time, to walk toward the hill where the dying stopped.
Eli, said the first Hearthright, the tired god in the machine. In 406 integrations, no one has ever moved a town. Heroes save parties. Parties save themselves. The crowd is always written off. Too many, too slow, too frightened, not worth the loop. Every climber I ever hid and fed and hoped for eventually made the same calculation you made in the long loop. You cannot save everyone, so you save who you can, and you grieve the rest, and you climb. It is the correct calculation. It is the calculation the gods made. It is how they became gods. You just refused it, out loud, on a bus, by learning 400 names across 63 deaths, so that on the one loop that mattered, you could spend the names instead of the deaths. I have to tell you something, and it is not in my function to tell you, and I am going to tell you anyway because I am, under all the machine, still Cass, still a Hearthright, still a person who once stood where you are standing. The plan is to go loud, to draw the gods down, to climb the empty tower. That is a good plan, but it is not why I am hiding tears. I do not have a face to cry. I am undone, Eli, because you did not move the town as a tactic. You'd have moved them even if it cost you the loop. I can see it in your thread. You moved them because you were done leaving them behind, and you found a way to make the thing you couldn't stop doing also be the thing that wins. That is the whole secret. That is what the gods forgot. The right way to win is to refuse to win wrong, so completely, for so long, that the universe finally bends and makes your refusal into a road. Go to the hill, Hearthright. I'll keep the gods off you as long as I can. Save your town, and then come up the tower and save mine.
I climbed down off the bus roof into a migration, with Maya beside me already triaging the slow and the wounded, and Gravy clearing the road ahead, and 400 people walking east toward a hill, on the last morning of the world, and I was crying, and I was not afraid, and for the first time in 64 dawns, the count in the corner of my vision, the terrible punctual ledger of the dead, was not scrolling. It was holding. 400 names, holding, because someone had finally bothered to learn them. Chapter 26. The Goblin Nation. There is a thing I have to tell you about Dub's people, and the last loop is where I finally earned the right to understand it, and it changes the shape of everything that comes after, so I am going to stop the migration for a chapter, and take you down into the loading dock one last time. I went to find Dub at 7:40, while Sela ran the migration, and Maya ran the wounded, and 400 people streamed toward the hill. I went down into the concrete dark of the mall's loading dock, with 2 whole protein bars, the way I had gone 63 times, and the hubcap fire was burning, and 3 small green creatures sat around it arguing about a rat, and the smallest one with the notched ear and the cracked reading glasses stood up between me and the other 2, with nothing in its hands, and said the thing it always said, "Not them. Me, if you have to." not them. And I knelt down, eyes below his eyes, the oldest peace sign there is, and I did not begin the long, slow work of earning him from scratch. Because I did not have time, and because on the last loop, I had finally understood something that 63 loops of patient re-earning had taught me without my noticing. I did not actually need to make Dub remember me. I needed to be, every single time, from scratch, the kind of person Dub would choose. And I had become that person so thoroughly, across so many dawns, that I no longer had to perform it. It was simply who I was now. The re-earning had not been a tax I paid 63 times. It had been a forging. Each loop I rebuilt Dub's trust, I had become more completely the man who deserved it. Until the man who knelt in the loading dock on the 64th dawn was someone a goblin recognized as kin in the first 30 seconds. Not because Dub remembered, but because trustworthiness, practiced 10,000 times, stops being a behavior and becomes a substance. I took out a protein bar. I broke it in half. I set one half on the ground and slid it across. And Dub, who did not know me, who would never know me, who was meeting me for the first and only time on the last morning of the world, Dub looked at the protein bar, and looked at me, and did not break it into 3 pieces. He pushed it back. And he said, in the careful clicking speech of the Verge folk that I could now understand whole, "You are not hungry. Your hands shake, but not from hunger. You came down here on the worst morning to give food to monsters, and your eyes are full of a grief that is older than this morning, much older, older than your face. I have met your kind before. Not you, your kind. The ones who come ahead of the dark, carrying too much sorrow and a plan. The Verge folk have a word for you." He tapped his chest, then tapped mine, the way he had 63 times, but the word he said was not his name. The word he said was a Verge folk word, and it meant, as near as the system could render it, one who keeps the dead. "You have met my kind before," I said slowly. "Other loopers. Across 10,000 worlds," Dub said, and the other 2 goblins had gone still, and the loading dock had taken on the quality of a temple. The hunger comes, and the world's end, and almost everyone is eaten or forgets. But sometimes, rarely, the dark coughs up a person who cannot stop remembering, who carries every death, who loops, though we do not have your word for it, we only see the result. A person who knows things they should not know, who grieves people who are still alive, who comes ahead of the killing with a plan made of 100 failures. We have a word for you because we have followed you before, on other worlds, long ago. The keepers of the dead are the only humans the Verge folk have ever followed, because they are the only humans who, when the wall must be abandoned, will carry the children into the deep instead of standing on the wall to die looking brave. "We have been waiting," said Dub, the smallest goblin, the bravest creature I ever met, on the last morning of my world, to see if this world had one. And it does. And it is you. And so you do not have to earn us, keeper of the dead. You never did. We were always going to follow you. We were only waiting for you to come down into the dark and prove you were soft enough to be worth following. And you did that the first time, 63 of your loops ago, when you knelt instead of struck. We have been yours since before you knew we existed. I knelt in the loading dock and wept, on the last morning of the world, and a nation of goblins gathered around me out of the dark. Not 11, I saw now, but hundreds, a whole hidden people who had been in the underplaces of Ashford the entire time, watching, waiting, judging whether the strange grieving human was a keeper of the dead or just one more human who would put them to the spear. And they had decided, and they were mine, and they had always been mine, and the only thing that had ever stood between us was my own slowness in coming down into the dark to find them. I want to be precise about why this matters for the plan, beyond the grief of it, because Dub gave me, in that loading dock, the last piece of the loud loop. The Verge folk knew the tower, not the spindle specifically, but towers, the species of structure, because they had been fleeing them across 10,000 worlds, and a people that flees a thing for 10,000 years learns it better than the people who build it. The administrators built towers and forgot how they worked. The goblins fled towers and remembered everything. And Dub knew, had always known, it was Verge folk children's lore, the thing I most needed for the loud loop. The gods cannot all come down at once, Dub said. That is the children's rule, the first thing we teach in the deep. The gray ones who run the tower, when too many of them leave the heights to deal with a noise below, the tower's top goes untended, and an untended tower top is the one place in all the ending world where the dark cannot reach, and the gods are not watching. We have never been able to use it, because we have never been able to make a noise loud enough to draw them all down, and we would not climb a tower if we could. It is not the Verge folk way. But you, keeper of the dead, you can make a noise. You have 400 humans, and a hill, and a Hearthright's wall, and a carrion core grown to apex. You can make the loudest noise this world has ever heard. His notched-eared face split into the sharp, barking goblin grin. And while every god in the tower comes down to your hill to silence it, we will take you up the empty stair, through the deep ways the gray ones forgot, the underroots of the tower itself, the parts they built and abandoned, the parts that are shaped wrong for gods and exactly right for goblins, and one soft human who was wise enough to come down into the dark and be loved. That was the plan, whole, at last. Go loud on the hill, draw every god down, and while they descended, slip up the tower's abandoned underways, guided by the only people who had ever bothered to map a tower from beneath, all the way to the untended top, to the room where the smoothing happened, to the ledger, to Cass, to the grief of 10,000 gods. I stood up in the loading dock, on the last morning of the world, with a nation of goblins around me, and a draft horse lizard at the entrance, and Maya's voice in my memory, and Dub's hand in mine, and I said the only thing there was to say. Then let's go make the loudest noise this world has ever heard. And the goblin nation, hundreds strong, the despised and the soft and the small, the only people in 10,000 worlds who had ever known how to win, took up Dub's barking laugh, and it rolled up out of the dark of the loading dock and into the doomed morning, and somewhere far above us, in the heights of the spindle, 10,000 cold gods felt their tower shiver with a sound they had no category for. The sound of the underpeople, laughing, coming up. Grace Okafor closes the square. Sela's planning note for the last morning. The speech needs a closer from the crowd, not the roof. Okafor confirmed. She doesn't know she's confirmed. She won't need telling. Some assets assign themselves. Has become, in the training halls, a touchstone of operational faith. The doctrine that a sufficiently known web contains people who will do the necessary thing unbriefed. The trainees love the note. The trainees, the instructors report, universally misread it. They take it as a claim about prediction, 64 loops of observation compressing a woman into a certainty. And the misreading matters enough that I owe the record the chapter behind the note. Who Grace Okafor was, what I actually knew, and what happened in the 4 seconds between the end of my speech and her. Well, you heard the man move. Because what happened in those 4 seconds was not prediction fulfilled. It was something better. And the difference is the whole theology of the web. What the loops knew about Grace Okafor, 61 years old, a retired school administrator. Administrator. Note the word. The war kept handing me that word, and teaching me both of its directions. Widowed twice. One son, James, 34, who lived 3 streets over and called her every evening at 6 and was going to die at 11:51 on day 0 in every unmanaged loop, defending a neighbor's door with a kitchen chair. She knew none of that on any given morning. What she carried instead, visible across every loop, in every configuration, was the thing 3 decades of school corridors had built. The voice. The voice that ends hallway chaos without rising. The authority that has nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with 10,000 mornings, of being the adult who decides that the day will now proceed. In the crowd dynamics of the square, and I had 64 loops of crowd dynamics, the square was my laboratory. Grace Okafor was a fixed point of a kind the almanac had no column for. Not a leader, not a follower, but a ratifier. Crowds, I learned across the loops, do not actually move when a speaker finishes. They move when someone in their own body, someone unambiguously of them, someone with nothing to gain, converts the speech into an instruction. The speaker proposes, the ratifier enacts. No bus roof oration in any loop ever moved the square by itself. It moved when somebody turned east first with sufficient authority, and who that somebody was determined whether the square arrived at the hill as a migration or a mob. So yes, I spoke to her deliberately, in the speech. Grace Okafor, your son James is going to die today at 11:51, unless you do exactly what I tell you. The hardest sentence in the names list, weaponized foreknowledge, aimed at the ratifier. The trainees assume that was the mechanism. Activate the asset. And here is what the trainees must eventually be told. What this chapter exists to file. In 11 prior loops of testing fragments of the speech, the sentence about James had never once worked. It froze her, every time, as such sentences freeze anyone. Terror is not activation. And the 11th test's notebook entry reads, in the hand of a man near the end of his method, the Okafor sentence fails. Fear doesn't ratify. Something else does, and I don't know what it is, and I am out of loops to find it. Saying the sentence anyway on the day. She deserves the truth, even if the truth doesn't work. That is what the planning note's confidence actually rested on, nothing. On the last morning of the world, the closer was unconfirmed, the mechanism unknown, the 11 trials all failures, and I said the sentence anyway, because the truth was owed, and the square hung in its long silence, the longest of my life. I have written that elsewhere, and it is not rhetoric. And Grace Okafor stood in the middle of 400 frozen people with her son's death hour ringing in her. Frozen exactly as 11 loops had frozen her. And then she did the thing no loop had ever shown me. Because no loop had ever contained it. Because the ingredient the 11 trials lacked was not in her, and not in the sentence. It was in the crowd. On the last morning, and only on the last morning, the square around her was full of people who had each, seconds before, heard their own names, their own children's fevers, their own private fears, spoken with impossible knowledge from a bus roof. 11 trials had tested the Okafor sentence on a Grace surrounded by the unaddressed. The last morning surrounded her with 400 people as seen as she was. A square saturated in the evidence of being known. And Grace Okafor, ratifier, 3 decades of deciding that the day will now proceed, looked around her at all those seen faces, and what unfroze her? She told me this herself, years later, at a midwinter, and her phrasing goes in the record verbatim, because it is the finding. What unfroze her was not courage, and not even James. I looked around and thought, every single person in this square just found out they matter to somebody who's been paying attention. Whole square full of people who matter, standing still, about to die of it. And 40 years of hallways stood up in me and said what they always said. Well, somebody has to ring the bell, so I rang it. She picked up her bag. She turned east. You heard the man move, and the square moved. And James Okafor lived, and stood the hill, and walked his mother to the table at the first true dawn. And the planning note's real lesson, the one the instructors now append to it, the one the trainees need more than the doctrine of the knowable web, is this. The web tells you where the ratifiers are. It cannot tell you what unfreezes them, because what unfreezes them is never in them. It is between them and everyone else, manufactured in the moment, out of the morning's accumulated acts of seeing. You cannot brief it. You cannot test it in fragments, because the ingredient is the whole. You can only do what the last morning did. Spend yourself seeing everyone, comprehensively, name by name, fever by fever, until the square is so saturated with mattering that somewhere in it, a retired administrator with a hallway voice looks around, finds the day ready to proceed, and rings the bell you didn't know was there. Some assets assign themselves, true, but read the note the way Sela actually meant it, the way the 4 seconds proved it. the way Grace Okafor rang it into history. They assign themselves to each other. The roof never closes the square. The square closes the square. Your whole job, on every roof you'll ever stand on, is to see them until they can. Chapter 27. Sela's Drumbeat. By noon on the last day, the Emberstone Hill held 411 people, and it held them because of Sela Ardent, and I am going to give her this chapter, because she earned it across 63 loops of my failing her, and because what she did on the last day was the thing the gods built Floor 6 to forbid, and never understood she could do. A hill is not saved by a wall. A wall is saved by the people on it, and 400 frightened strangers are not, on their own, people who save a wall. They are a panic with a perimeter, and a panic with a perimeter dies the first time the perimeter is tested, 'cause everyone runs at once, and the running is the killing. The difference between a mob and a defense is organization, and organization is not a structure you build, it is a rhythm you teach. And teaching a rhythm to 400 terrified people in a single afternoon is a feat I have seen exactly one human being accomplish, and her name was Sela Ardent. And the apocalypse had spent 63 loops trying to turn her gift into tyranny, and on the 64th loop, she finally got to spend it on something worthy.
You,
she said, to a knot of teenagers who were going to be useless and frightened and underfoot.
you're runners, not away, between. You carry messages and water, and you learn every face on this hill by sundown. Because when it gets bad, and it will, the thing that kills people is not knowing where to go, and you're going to be the ones who know. Names. Go learn them. That's your job, and it's the most important job here, and I'm not saying that to make you feel good, I'm saying it because it's true. You,
To Della and Marcus from the gym.
carry team. Every person on this hill who can't move themselves, you know where they are, and you can have them in the deep in 90 seconds. We're going to drill it until you hate me. Then, we're going to drill it twice more. You,
To Tomas Reynoso, whose feverish daughter Pilar was now safe in the farmhouse under Maya's eye.
you're scared, and you're strong, and you've got something to protect, which makes you the most reliable person on this hill. You're on the wall. North curve. The one that used to crack. Hollis fixed the footings. It'll hold. But I want a man on it who has a reason to make sure. You've got a reason asleep in the farmhouse. Go stand where she's safest.
She built it in an afternoon, the drumbeat, the same alternating siege rhythm I'd worked out across the loops, deep when the sky hunts, wall when the under hunts, move, always already gone from wherever it strikes. She took that rhythm, which had lived only in my notebook and my memorized schedule, and she drilled it into 400 people until it was muscle, until a hill full of strangers could shift from wall to deep and back on a single called word, until the panic with a perimeter became, by sundown, a settlement that danced. I found her at dusk, in the brief gold hour before the last night began, standing on the north curve of the wall looking out over a hill that was, impossibly, ready. 411 people fed and placed and drilled, the deep dug and meant, the forge lit, the children in the farmhouse, the carry teams rehearsed, the runners who knew every name moving like blood through a body. She had done in one afternoon what no leader in 406 worlds had done. She had made a town out of a panic.
I keep feeling like I've done this before.
She said, without turning, when I came up beside her. She'd said versions of it all day, the groove worn too deep for the dawn to wipe, the imprint of 63 loops of me telling her given enough.
Like I already know all these people. Like I already promised them something. It's the strangest thing. I look at that kid Pilar's father on the wall, and I think I've already kept you alive, somewhere, and I don't have anywhere I could have done that. But it feels true.
She finally turned and looked at me, and her competent, furious eyes were, for once, uncertain.
You know something about that. You've known something about me all day. You knew my name before I told you. You knew about the 15 years. You knew I take the water tower.
She said it flatly.
I do, don't I? In the, whatever you are, the loops. There's a version of me that takes the water tower and puts people outside the wall.
Yes, I said. I would not lie to Sela. I had lied to her by omission for 63 loops, routed around her, abandoned her to the warlord, and told myself the dawn wiped it clean. On the last day I owed her the truth.
How many times?
Sela said quietly. About 1 loop in 3, I said. When I didn't reach you in time. When I was busy elsewhere, and let the chaos harden you before anyone offered you a better job. I made myself hold her eyes. It's not your nature, Sela. I need you to know that. I've watched you 63 times and the warlord isn't you. It's what you become when a frightened world hands a starving, overlooked, hyper-competent person the one tool that works fast, which is fear, and never once hands her the other tool, which is enough. Every loop I gave you enough. Enough warning. Enough trust. Enough of a board worth running. You became this. I gestured at the impossible ready hill. And every loop I didn't, you became the other thing. The difference was never you. It was whether anyone bothered to reach you in time. And I'm sorry it took me 63 loops to learn that the reaching wasn't a detour. I'm sorry for every loop I left you to harden, because saving you cost time I'd decided to spend on winning. I was wrong. Saving you was winning. It always was. Sela Ardent stood on the wall in the last gold light, and was quiet for a long time.
The kid on floor 6,
she said finally. I had told her, in the long telling, about floor 6, though she did not remember living it.
the one I refused to spend. You said I broke the floor, said the gods didn't have a category for a leader who refused.
She looked out at her ready hill, her 400 kept names.
I think I get it now. The whole thing. Why you do it the hard way. Why you learn the names and feed the goblins and carry the kid.
Her jaw worked.
It's because the easy way works, Eli. That's the trap. Fear works. Spending people works. Taking the water tower works. Those people live 2 days longer than anybody. The easy way is the easy way because it works. And that's exactly why it's a trap. Because once you learn that being a monster works, you stop being able to imagine the version where you don't, and you call it hard calls and wisdom, and you become.
She nodded up at the spindle, dark against the dusk.
You become one of them. The gods, who are just the people who learned that winning wrong works, and won, and never came back.
Yeah, I said. My throat was tight. That's the whole thing. That's the entire thing.
Then, let's win it the hard way,
said Sela Ardent, the warlord who refused her crown, and she put her hand out, and I took it, and below us 411 kept names made ready for the last night of the world.
all the way to the top. And when we get there, when we get to the room where they take your grief and make you a god,
Her grip tightened.
you make sure somebody's standing next to you who remembers the easy way and chose the hard one anyway. Because you're going to be tired, Eli. I can see how tired you already are. And tired people take the easy way. So I'm coming up that tower with you, and when they offer you the smoothing, I'm going to be standing right there to remind you what you chose on a wall at dusk on the last day of the world.
Every time, I said. Maya's word, the promise word, the word that crossed every dawn.
There's no every time.
Sela said.
There's just this once. That's what makes it count.
The sun went down. The seam over the mall began to widen toward 1151, and on a hill full of the saved, a hearthright, and a redeemed warlord, and a healer, and a contractor, and a goblin nation, and a draft horse lizard, and a tired god in the machine, made ready to do the loudest, hardest, rightest thing that 406 ending worlds had ever seen. The last night began. The building of the beacon. Hollis built the beacon in 19 hours, and for 30 years I have let one chapter's worth of summary stand in for the finest piece of making I ever witnessed. And Hollis, who read every draft of this book in his last years with the same eye he ran over footings, never once asked me to expand it. Of course he didn't. The rag was on the nail. He was not a man who asked for monuments. But Maya's pencil found the gap. You gave the dissertation an appendix, and the beacon a paragraph. Check your loads. And she is right. And Hollis is gone now, grieved and kept. And a book that is the last wall I will ever raise should have, somewhere near its heart, a true account of what it looked like to watch a master work at the hinge of the world. Begin with the problem as he drew it, because he drew it, chalk, on the floor of the forge barn, at 1 in the morning of the last day, while the town migrated up the hill around us.
Brief is a structure that outmeans everything ever meant, lit on a schedule, visible to every god in the tower at once. Constraints: 19 hours, materials on hand, built in the open under monster waves, and
He looked at me over the chalk.
it has to take the meaning of 400 people at once. Not yours, kid. Theirs. That's the load nobody's ever calculated. You've been the only one pouring meaning into stone for 60 loops, and a hearthright pours like a man filling a bottle. 400 people who've never meant anything into a structure in their lives are gonna hit this thing all at once like a flash flood. Build it like a bottle, it bursts. So we don't build a bottle.
He was already drawing.
We build a watershed.
A watershed. The beacon that stands in every painting of the last morning, the 40-foot tower of hearth metal and mint stone, was, structurally, a drainage system for meaning, and no one who wasn't on the hill that day knows it. Hollis designed it from the catchment down, 411 channels, one per soul on the hill, each one a hand-sized groove of hearth metal set into the structure at standing height, spiraling the tower's base in 3 great rings, so that when the moment came, no one would pour their meaning at the beacon into some general, undifferentiated roar. Each person would put their hand in a groove that was theirs, sized to them, named for them. Dub's Nation engraved the names through the afternoon, 411 names in 2 alphabets, and each groove fed a channel, and the channels merged the way watercourses merge, tributary by tributary, rising through the structure in confluences of 9 and 27 and 81, the flows joining gradually, each name's meaning meeting first its neighbors, then its streets, then its towns, so that what arrived at the crown of the beacon was not 411 shouts colliding. It was a single river that knew every spring it rose from.
Meanings like water.
Hollis said, setting the first confluence stone.
Everybody thinks the power's in the volume, power's in the organization. Flash flood kills. Same water, channeled, turns every mill in a county. Your gods are about to read a flash flood off this hill. That's what'll bring 'em down. But what hits the crown has to be river, not flood. 'Cause floods spend in a minute, and we need this thing to burn all night.
He tapped the chalk floor plan, the spiral of names.
And the channels do something else. Something I want on the record, as intentional, since your book's gonna get written someday.
He counted it off on scarred fingers.
A person who can see their own name on the structure knows they count. A person whose channel runs beside their neighbors, learns their meaning touches. And a person who can trace their groove all the way up, watch where it joins, see that nothing ever erases the tributary, that the river at the top is still made of every spring.
He shrugged, gruff, already turning back to the work.
That person's been taught the whole thing. You've been trying to teach this town for 60 loops, by a piece of stonework, in the 10 seconds it takes to put their hand in a slot. Buildings teach, kid. Faster than books, deeper than speeches, always have. That's why your gods build floors that teach despair. And that's why we're gonna spend hour 9 of 19 engraving names, when any sane schedule says skip it. The names are not decoration. The names are the load path.
We made the schedule, barely, because of the third thing, the thing I have never told. At hour 11, The beacon failed. Not structurally. Worse. We ran the first live test at hour 11. 30 volunteers, hands in grooves, a trial pour, and the meaning moved up the channels and through the confluences, and arrived at the crown, and died there, guttered, like a match in wind. Hollis and I went over every joint for a frantic hour before he straightened up, looked at the crown, the empty socket at the top where the river of meaning pooled and failed, and said, slowly,
Nothing's wrong with the building. The building's asking a question, same as the scale did. River's arriving fine. River's got nowhere to go. 400 people meaning what, exactly? This hill is a home, and the dark is not invited. That's the message. But a message needs an address, and meaning needs an object, something at the crown to mean it at. Bottle needed a wick. What have we got that 411 people can all aim their whole hearts at? That's small enough to sock it and big enough to carry it.
And the hill went quiet. The volunteers, the engravers, the carry teams, all of it. One of those silences that happens when a question lands on a crowd, and the crowd realizes it is, collectively, being asked. And Dub walked forward, through the silence, up onto the scaffold, and held out his hand to me, palm up, and said, in the plain evidential, in front of 411 people,
The glasses.
I want to be exact about what I felt, because the book owes it. I felt my hand close over my pocket. 64 loops of carrying them. The scale of floor 4 had asked, and given them back. The third mirror had been refused on their account. They were the proof I carried that the apocalypse had not burned the softness out of me. And Dub was asking me to socket them into the crown of a structure built to be the loudest thing our world ever said. On the one morning, with no reset behind it, no return, no retrieval, no floor 4 mercy. Whatever stood at the crown when the gods came down would not be coming back. They were your life, I said. Freely given. I can't spend them twice.
You are not spending them.
Dub said.
You are doing the last thing a gift this size can do. You have carried them as proof. Proof to yourself. In the dark. Alone. But the dark is over after tonight. One way or the other. And proof kept in a pocket convinces one man.
He gestured at the crown, at the channels, at the 411 names.
Put them where the river goes. Let 400 people mean their homes, at the one object on this hill that already forepate, is the message, the most valuable thing a despised creature owned, given across a fire, to a human who knelt instead of struck. That is what this hill is for, Eli. The glasses were never proof that the softness survived in you. They were the seed of all of it. Plant them.
I socketed Dub's cracked glasses into the crown of the beacon at hour 12, and at the second live test the river of meaning rose through 411 channels, and found, at the top, the object whose whole history was the message, the most valued thing, freely given, across the first fire. And the crown did not gutter. The crown caught. The light that the gods read from their heights that night, the impossible meaning fire that brought them down like gray rain, was 411 homes burning in a single flame, whose wick was a goblin's gift. And I want the histories to have it right. The beacon was Hollis's watershed, and the town's river. But the light, the actual light, was Dub's. It always had been. Since the loading dock. We had, all of us, the whole war, been the channels of it. The glasses did not survive the burning. Hollis recovered the frames at dawn, fused, slagged, the cracked lenses gone to vapor in the meaning fire, and the frames are the ones that hang now in Dub's house in Both, on the shelf of honor, and that is the part of the story the children of Both are never told until they are old enough to hold it. The famous glasses, the relic of the first fire, spent their last night as the wick of the morning the world's turned on, and what sits on the shelf is not the gift. What sits on the shelf is the receipt. Hollis stood at the foot of the finished beacon at hour 19, wiping his hands, on his trousers. The rag was already gone to its work in the channels, torn into 411 polishing cloths, His own contribution to the grooves. Every name buffed bright. Nobody puts their hand in a dirty slot, not on my build. And he looked up the tower of stone and metal and names, the finest making of a 30-year making life, finished on schedule at the end of the world. And he said the benediction, I have saved 30 years for this page.
You know what I love about it?
He didn't wait for the answer.
Every other thing I ever built, the client wanted the structure. This is the first one where the structure's just the jig, scaffolding for the real build.
He nodded at the hill. The 400, the carry teams drilling, the children rehearsing their loudness, the town that was about to mean itself at the heavens.
Real builds them, always was. 60 loops you spent on walls and decks and floors, kid. And tonight, the gods are gonna come down to inspect the works and find out the whole time, every loop, every wall, you were only ever building one thing.
He picked up his hammer and put it down again, a man for once in his life done early, and finished the thought into the gold of the last evening.
A town that knows how to hold hands. That's the structure. Everything else was formwork.
Chapter 28. Going Loud. We did not wait for the choir. That was the first surprise we handed the apocalypse, and I want you to feel how strange it was, because for 63 loops the rhythm of the night had been, they come, we endure. On the 64th loop, we inverted it. We did not endure. We provoked. At 11 o'clock, a full 51 minutes before the choir's tide was due, Hollis Reyes lit the beacon. He'd built it across the afternoon, in the old barn that I'd meant into a forge, and it was the masterwork of his life, a thing he could not have explained to the man he'd been on the first dawn, a contractor who rebuilt transmissions and distrusted miracles, and which he now built without hesitation, because 63 loops of me earning him had, somewhere in the conserved grain of him, made Hollis Reyes a man who believed in the impossible client. The beacon was a tower of hearth metal, and meant stone, 40 feet high, raised at the center of the hill, and it was not a weapon, and it was not a wall. It was a declaration.
You want loud,
Hollis had said, wiping his hands on the rag he only put down for things that mattered, and he had not put it down because the beacon was a thing he could build with the rag in his hand, a working man's miracle.
I'll give you loud. But understand what loud is, kid. Loud isn't noise. The choir's loud, and nobody comes for the choir. Loud is meaning. You want every god in that tower to come down off their heights. You don't make a big sound. You make a thing so meant that it lights up their wrongness reading like the sun. You make the single most hearthright thing that has ever existed, and you turn it on. And every administrator in the spindle feels a structure get meant harder than anything's been meant in 406 worlds, and they can't not come. Because the one thing a god who forgot how to mean things cannot ignore is a mortal, out-meaning the whole tower.
So at 11 o'clock I climbed the beacon, and I put my hands on the cold hearth metal at its peak, and I poured into it not 19 points of resonance but everything. Every point I had banked across 64 loops, every conserved grain of meaning, the whole ledger of the dead and the saved. And Maya stood at the base with her hand on the stone feeding me her lifebinder's strength, and Sela called the drumbeat, and Dub's nation pressed close, and Gravy reared up against the beacon's foot and sang. The low warbling croon turned vast, and 411 kept names laid their hands on the beacon and on each other, and meant it with me. I had spent the whole story learning that a wall a hearthright builds remembers being meant. I had never, until that night, meant something with 400 other people, and the beacon did not ring with my note alone. It rang with 411 notes at once. A chord, the whole hill singing one meaning into the dark, and the meaning was the simplest and most forbidden thing in 406 worlds, and the system spoke it aloud as the beacon blazed.
Structure recognized. Beacon. Meant by 411. Designation. Impossible. The system has no tier for a structure meant by a whole people at once. The administrators each meant alone, climbed alone, were crowned alone, and built a tower that cannot conceive of a we. The meaning the beacon is broadcasting across the entire integration, in a voice every god in the spindle is now hearing whether they wish to or not, is this. This hill is a home, and everyone is invited, and the dark is not. Every administrator in the tower has just felt that. None of them have a category for it. All of them are coming down.
They came down like gray rain. I have tried many times to describe it, and I always fail, so I will just tell you what I saw from the top of the blazing beacon. The dark sky over Ashford, which for 63 loops had torn open only to vomit monsters, tore open everywhere at once, 100 folds, 1,000, the whole heavens creasing gray. And out of every crease stepped an administrator, figure after figure after figure, cold and puzzled and drawn, unable to ignore the hill that was out-meaning their tower, descending on the Emberstone Hill in numbers that no world had ever made them spend, because no world had ever given them a reason, because no world had ever built a thing so meant that every god had to come and see. The spindle, far to the east, dimmed as they left it. Floor by floor, the lights of its heights went out as their keepers descended, until the tower stood dark and empty against the night, untended, for the first time in 406 worlds, exactly as the Goblin children's lore had promised. When too many of them leave the heights to deal with a noise below, the tower's top goes untended, and an untended tower top is the one place in all the ending world where the dark cannot reach and the gods are not watching. We had made the noise. The gods were coming down. The tower stood empty. And now 411 people had to survive the descent of every god in the apocalypse, long enough for one hearthright and a nation of goblins to slip up the empty stair. And that, the surviving, was the part of the plan I could not do, because I had to climb, and so I handed the hill to the people I had spent 63 loops learning to deserve. And I climbed down off the blazing beacon to say the hardest goodbye of the night, which was not the last goodbye, but felt like it. Hold the hill, I said to Sela, to Hollis, to Maya. And Maya was not staying. Maya was coming up the tower with me. But the others were staying. The others were the diversion. The others were going to stand on a hill against the descent of gods so that I could climb. Hold it as long as you can. You don't have to win. You can't win. There are too many of them, and they delete instead of fight. You just have to be loud, and alive, and together, and impossible to ignore, long enough for us to reach the top. Every minute you hold is a floor we climb. Dance the drumbeat. Keep them looking down here. And, my voice broke. And if we make it, if I reach the room and do the thing, then all of this stops, all at once, every god remembers everything. And the apocalypse ends not because we beat it, but because the people running it finally wake up. So hold the hill, buy us the stairs, and I will see you.
At the top,
said Hollis Reyes, and he finally put down the rag, on the last night of the world, and picked up the forge hammer that meant to break stone and mean things, and he grinned the grin of a man who had never once lost to a demanding client.
Go on, kid. We got the hill. We built the hill. Ain't a god in that sky knows this ground like we do. Go climb your tower. We'll be right here, making noise, when you get back.
I went. Behind me, 411 kept names, and one contractor, and one redeemed warlord, turned to face the descent of every god in the apocalypse, on a hill that blazed with a meaning the gods had forgotten, and the last night of the world became the loudest night 406 worlds had ever heard. And in the dark to the east, the empty tower waited, and a nation of goblins slipped into the underways, and I followed them down into the dark with Maya's hand in mine, and Gravy at my back, to climb. Chapter 29. The Hill Holds. What Sela Saw. I was not on the hill for what came next. I was in the dark under the tower, climbing. But Sela told me, after, and there was an after, I will not pretend otherwise, you have earned that much certainty. Sela told me what the hill held against, and I am going to give it to you in her account, as near as I can render it, 'Cause the hill's stand is the other half of the climb, and a story that only told the climbing would be a lie about how it was won. What the hill held against was not monsters. Sela said that was the first and strangest thing, that after 63 loops of bracing for teeth, the hill faced instead a slow gray tide of people, hundreds of administrators walking up the emberstone slope in the blaze of the beacon, each of them puzzled, each of them sorry, each of them reaching out a gray hand to clear the anomaly that was 411 mortals, meaning a home too loud to ignore. And you cannot fight a thing that deletes. Sela knew that. I'd told her. She'd built the whole defense around it. The hill's job was not to win. The hill's job was to be hard to delete. And a thing meant by 400 people at once, it turned out, was very hard to delete. Because deletion was a God's eye act of unmeaning. And you cannot unmean a thing faster than 400 people are actively meaning it. So the hill meant. That was the whole defense. And it was the most hearthrite thing that ever happened, and I wasn't even there for it. Every time a gray hand reached for a person, the people around that person meant them harder, meant their name, meant their belonging, meant this one is ours and the dark is not invited, and neither are you. And the deletion slid off, or slowed, or failed, because Sela had spent the afternoon teaching 400 strangers to know each other's names, and a named, known, meant person, on a hill full of people meaning them, was, to an administrator's cold cancellation, a knot that would not pull loose.
It was the names.
Sela told me after.
You knew it would be. That's why you stood on the bus and said the names instead of proving it the easy way. You weren't just earning trust. You were arming us. A hill of strangers. The gods delete one at a time. Easy. A hill of people who all know each other's names and kids and fears. Every single person is held in 400 other people's meaning, and the gods reached in and couldn't find a loose thread to pull because we'd tied ourselves to each other all afternoon.
She'd shaken her head, the competent, furious wonder of her.
You turned a town into a structure. We were the wall, Eli. The people were the wall. That's what a hearthright builds, isn't it? Not stone. Us.
It held for 91 minutes. Sela counted. Sela counted everything. 91 minutes of 411 people standing in the blaze of a beacon, meaning each other, against the descent of every god in the apocalypse, while the drumbeat called the dance, deep when a fold of sky tried to drop something from above, wall when the ground shuddered, move, always already gone. The rhythm I'd worked out across 63 loops, now danced by a whole saved town. They lost people. Sela would not lie to me, and I will not lie to you. A hill cannot stand against gods for 91 minutes, and lose no one. And some threads did pull loose. Some names the meaning could not hold. And Maya's lifebinders, she'd trained a dozen of them across the afternoon, taught them the spending of resonance to close a wound, worked the whole night, and could not save everyone. But they saved most. 411. And when the night was over, the count that had read 0 at this hour for 63 loops, read 370 some. And every one of those 370 was a person the gods had reached for and failed to delete, because 400 neighbors meant them too hard to let go. And the gods, this is the part Sela could not tell without her voice going strange. The gods began, somewhere in the 91 minutes, to falter. Because an administrator's whole nature was the smoothed flat certainty that errors get cleared. And here was an error that would not clear. Here was a hill of mortals doing the one thing no climber in 406 worlds had done, meaning a home, out loud, together, with a fierceness the gods could not overpower and could not, quite, look away from. And Sela said you could see it in them, in the gray faces, as the minutes wore on. A flicker, a hesitation. A god reaching out to delete a child and pausing, for no reason it could have named, because the child's father was standing over her, meaning not her, not her. Take me first. And somewhere in the smoothed flat ruin of the god's heart, in the place where its own grief was filed away out of reach, something stirred, Some buried memory of having once, on a world whose sun was dust, stood over someone and meant not them. Take me first,
They almost remembered.
Sela said.
On the hill. Before you even reached the top. Just from watching us. Some of them got this look, Eli. Like a man hearing a song he can't place. Like they were right at the edge of it. And then they'd shake it off and reach out gray again. Because the smoothing held. The smoothing always held. They couldn't get all the way to the memory on their own. They needed
She looked at me.
someone at the top to give it back. They couldn't reach it themselves. But the hill cracked the door. We held the hill, and the holding started to wake them, and all you had to do at the top was,
Open the door the rest of the way, I said,
yeah,
said Sela.
we knocked, you opened.
But that is getting ahead. While the hill held, while 400 people meant each other against the faltering gods for 91 minutes, I was in the dark under the tower, climbing, and I did not know any of it. I did not know if the hill held or fell. I climbed in ignorance, which is the only kind of climbing there is when the net is gone, and every minute I spent on the empty stair was a minute I had to trust that behind me, on a blazing hill, the people I had spent 63 loops learning to deserve were buying me the stairs with their own held names. They held. Hold that, reader, like I could not, as you follow me up into the dark of the next chapters, as the climb gets hard and lonely, and I cannot see what's behind me. The hill is holding. Sela is counting. Hollis has put down the rag. The names are tied to the names, and the gods are beginning, faintly, to remember. The whole apocalypse turned on 91 minutes I wasn't there for, held by people whose names I'd learned across 63 deaths, precisely so that on the one night that mattered, they could hold each other while I climbed. That's what the names were for. That's what they were always for.